Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you our 10.2 Disc Priest Raid Guide for Amirdrassil, breaking down everything that you need for the spec going into it. This is all about building up your atonements for specific damage events to be able to counter them by bursting large amounts of healing. And in 10.2, they've streamlined a lot of the specs that you are able to get through all the different stacking modifiers and immediately apply your atonements, deal damage, produce healing. That also means that Shadow Covenant and your pet are now aligned in their duration. So if you're extending the duration of your pet, you're also extending the duration of your Shadow Covenant. There's been some slight nerfs to some of our damage reduction in things like Barrier, and a number of abilities are kind of getting like coalesced together, where Mind Blast and Schism are now one ability, allowing you to more easily be able to pump out damage very rapidly without having to stack all these different buffs on top of each other. With this, there's a couple changes to our talent tree. Some new talents like Sanctuary are providing really good amounts of healing, especially when we get our set bonuses, which we'll talk about in this video, providing a lot of extra just easy output that you have on hand. This is going to be one of the first builds that we're going to talk about. There's going to be two that we're going to talk about in this video, but I primarily want to talk about the Mindbender setup, since I think it's going to be a lot easier for people to get into, and it's going to be very consistent whether you do or do not have your 4-set bonus. And the set track of how you're playing it is going to be a lot more straightforward than some of the Shadowfiend stuff, which might not be. With this, you could take Ultimate Penitence instead of the Blaze talents. I have Blaze selected by default. Ultimate Penitence is just kind of risky to be able to utilize properly, and it's like an okay cooldown. It's not particularly powerful. It's a really easy way to get killed with a number of different mechanics to be messing around with, and it does have a very long cooldown. But keep in mind, you can mess around with it. Divine Aegis was just nerfed alongside Inescapable Torment about 4 or 5 days ago. Divine Aegis is still really good. And your other options, you could potentially take something like Wheel and Woe, which is not bad either. But the difference between the gameplay of Divine Aegis and Wheel and Woe is very minor, where basically after your penance, you just have a supercharged smite to continue on with your ramps. And we're going to talk about that stuff in the gameplay section, but needless to say, your gameplay is not changing very heavily. The very big focus that you want to have when you're ramping and producing your output as disc is that you're playing around your Mindbender, getting its cooldown reduced as best as you possibly can by casting smites, penances, mind blasts to reduce its cooldown, to then align its cooldown with radiance charges. You always want to be using like your double radiance together, so that way you're going to be able to have like both your radiance charges, any extra atonements you can apply, and then your pet to give you your Shadow Covenant buff to increase your damage, to have the pet smacking along as well, which produces atonement, having buffs like Essence Devour to produce even more healing on top of it, to get this nice, quick, punchy burst of output when you need it. If you were to play a Shadowfiend focused build, of course, you are speccing out a Mindbender, you could potentially be putting these points into Ultimate Penitence, like we talked about, to get its cooldown to around like 2.5 or 3 minutes. You could also potentially be going into, like we mentioned before, Blaze and things like Wheel and Woe, if Ultimate Penitence is not going to be valuable on that encounter. The big point of gameplay when you play with Shadowfiend is that you have a ton of cooldown reduction at your disposal, thanks to Void Summoner and the additional smites you're getting out of your 4-set bonus. We'll talk about the tier set in just a second. With all of this cooldown reduction together, your 3-minute cooldown out of Shadowfiend can realistically become like a 1-minute cooldown or so. There's areas on like a patchwork fight where you could potentially get it down to like 40-45 seconds, but it's a bit of wishful thinking on a lot of the encounters that we're seeing out of Amirdrassil. So you want to anticipate it to be more of a minute cooldown. And with this, you're more likely to break up your Rapture and Evangelism and use them a little bit separately, so that you're always able to have large amounts of atonement being utilized every single time that you're hitting your Shadowfiend on hand. This is going to be a little more complicated, because instead of following like a set track where all your double radiance charges you're using all the time always have a pet on hand when you need them, this one's a little bit more flexible, where a longer cooldown Shadowfiend gets you a stronger Shadow Covenant, and you're trying to put it at areas where you need to have overwhelmingly large amounts of like burst output, rather than the slightly weaker Shadow Covenant that Mindbender would give you, but it gives you it more frequently. So again, it's just how it kind of aligns with fight timers. And to make it very simple, just so that I've explained all of these things, if you check in the description down below, we're going to have a raid tips page, and we're going to have updates for when you want to ramp, and also what talent setup you want to use when ramping. And so as I'm going through all these fights, I'll be updating it throughout progression as to which build I'm playing and how you want to be able to work it. But like I mentioned before, I would recommend people start with a Mindbender setup because it's more straightforward, it's more simple, and you have a very clear objective of like what you're going to do on each encounter. So I touched on the tier set a little bit here, and let's talk about it, okay? Your 2-piece bonus, Penitence and Smite's damage is increased by 20%, and Smite extends the duration of 1 active atonement by 2 seconds. This is also going to have synergy with your 4-set bonus, where Smite hits an additional time during Shadow Covenant, triggering additional cooldown reduction for your Train of Thought talent, which gives you more penance, and your Void Summoner talent, which gives you your pet back. It also is proccing an additional atonement extension from your 2-set bonus. So when you have Shadow Covenant up, you have your pet up, you hit Smite, it's hitting twice, and it's going to extend 2 active atonements by 2 seconds each. And that's going to make it very easy for you to, mainly like in dungeons, to be able to extend the duration onto like your tank or something. It's a nice like side benefit that you have in a raid, but it's not so like overwhelmingly powerful. It's probably like the atonement extension for this tier set is probably the weakest of the traits and the benefits that you're getting. The Penance and Smite damage is fantastic. You want to get your tier set, even just the 2 set, as fast as you possibly can. And the 4 set really gives you massive amounts of cooldown reduction, which is really kind of contingent on playing like a Shadowfiend setup, because you need all of those extra Smite hits to get your Shadowfiend cooldown as low as possible. So in terms of how your gameplay actually is going to look like, let's start with the Mindbender setup, because that's going to be as straightforward as it gets. You are going to want to make sure that you are farming up your Mindbender cooldown reduction by using Mind Blast, Penance, and Smite, and mainly like Smite in downtime, to always get your Mindbender cooldown to align with the 30-second time it takes to get both your Radiance charges back. So let's say if there's like one big damage mechanic at the start of a fight, Agira is a really good example of this, because the damage is just like you bounce from one mechanic to the next. And so in an encounter like Agira, you might start by rolling Rapture and Evangelism together, hitting Rapture, casting as many shields as you can during its duration. Usually you get it out like 8 to 10. Then hit both of your Radiance charges, extend their duration with Evangelism, cast your Mindbender, hit Mind Blast, hit Penance, using Shadow or Death outside of Execute because it procs Inescapable Torment for big damage. Cast your Halo, pound Smites until you get Penance back, hit Penance again, and then be pounding Smites. What this is going to be able to do for you is produce a really large burst of damage. And again, timers are going to be in the description down below, producing a large amount of damage, a large amount of burst single target damage to be able to reverse the incoming hits on people. You want to hit your Radiances together, extend their duration, and then hit your Mindbender, because each active cast of your Inescapable Tormenting proccing abilities, Mind Blast, Penance, Shadow or Death, are extending its duration, allowing you to get more procs of it, getting more uptime, getting more double taps of Smite. Make sure Shadowfiend or Mindbender is going to be your last cast before you start pumping damage, hitting as many Smites as you can until the damage has all fallen off. Then you enter Downtime, where you want to make sure you're maintaining atonement on basically just the tanks, whichever tank is active. On a fight like Agira, they're both active at the same time. And you might get like flash heal procs, and you can kind of spend them as you need to if somebody needs some spot healing. But you want to be hitting your Smites, hitting your Penance to help you farm up the next cooldown that you have for your Mindbender. And so following this 30-second track, you're going to wait until you get both of your Radiance charges, and you can single target apply some atonements if you have the mana for it using Shield or Renew. You can then hit your double Radiance, hit your Mindbender, and continue with the Mind Blast, Penance, Shadow or Death like we were talking about previously, to be able to continue your mini ramp sort of burst. And that's what's going to happen, is you're going to jump between using both your Radiance charges together with Mindbender, following your downtime period where you farm up your next Mindbender, using 2 Radiance charges with your pet once again, and then you get back to your Rapture Evangelism cooldown. Potentially, you can split Rapture Evangelism. It's not that big of a deal between them. Rapture is not nearly as powerful as it used to be. Personally, I like having them both together and then spending extra mana as I have it with Renew and Powered Shield for those mini ramps. If you were going to play a Shadowfiend playstyle, and that's where it gets a little bit more complicated, and that's why, again, I would recommend you play with Mindbender first, where you have to make sure that you're farming Shadowfiend enough so that you're going to be able to have it consistently for all the damage checks that are happening in an encounter. Something like maybe Tindril or maybe even Smolderon, you are going to have pretty consistent bursts of damage there, but it might come into an area on progress where it might be even more important for you to have a stronger Shadow Covenant for that duration, rather than having more consistent and weaker Shadow Covenants to cover the incoming damage hits. And like I said, that's where it gets more complicated, where you can potentially get really large amounts of cooldown reduction for Shadowfiend to take it from a 3 minute to like a 45, but you have to stand still for very long periods of time in order to net it out. The gameplay is going to stay the same, where you're applying single target atonements first, then following it up with your double radiances, extending the duration with evangelism, then hitting your pet, and following it up with the attacks like we mentioned before, Mind Blast into Penance, into Shadow or Death, Halo and Smite, and Penance again. You will follow that same sort of pattern. It's just going to be how you are timing utilizing those abilities, and that's where it gets a little bit more complex and in some cases kind of frustrating to be able to play around. Some frequent mistakes people make when playing Disc is they always try to make sure they're healing all the time no matter what, and that is not your focus. A lot of times people are expending like single radiances by themselves and trying to deal damage, or trying to like spot heal with flash heals and renews or something to always be healing and always be producing something, and that is not your objective when playing Disc. Your goal is to find very set times for when you're producing your output and when you're able to contribute your output at the highest strength possible. Since we're playing so heavily around our pet all the time, especially if you're running a Mindbender setup, every time that you are having your Mindbender available, you also want to have your Radiance charges, both of your Radiance charges available thanks to the Bright Pupil talent, making it a 15-second cooldown. So that way, if you have extra mana on hand, you can use shields and renew in conjunction with those Radiance charges, and then go into your single target damage rotation for when the damage is actually going to work. And then during downtime, you are chilling, building up towards your next Mindbender, you're building up towards your next ramp, and you are not trying to constantly be healing everybody all the time. A lot of times I do like banking surge procs for downtime so that if somebody does take damage, I can very quickly contribute some output to them when I need to. Always making sure I'm keeping my shields up onto the tanks, my atonement up onto the tanks while I'm smiting, so I'm constantly producing some output to be able to help them there, especially in like a progress environment. And of course, tracking any major debuffs for when people are soaking mechanics, might be taking extra hits, are always going to be absolutely important. But again, that's a little bit different than like constantly looking to be healing all the time. A lot of times this season in particular, you're going to get punished for moving around too much and not turreting, casting those smites, and building up towards your next ramp profile. It is insanely important this season, especially when you have Shadow Covenant up for those double tap smites. If you were going to run with Ultimate Penitence, you would not be utilizing it with Evangelism. You would have it separate from that. What you would want to do is you would basically make sure you have Purge the Wicked up on target, hit your Mind Blast, hit both your Radiance charges, then cast Ultimate Penitence while you are targeting an enemy. So that way you're channeling all of these penances into the single target, hopefully single target enemy. And then as you're coming down, you hit your penance as well to be able to try to get a little bit more damage out. If you wanted to run something like the Overloaded with Light for the extra atonement application, basically you would have both your Radiance charges being used, then hit Ultimate Penitence, go up in the air, and it would apply 10 more atonements, and then start channeling all of this damage into the target. It worked out pretty well, but it's just very expensive as a talent to take. And of course, there's just a lot of ground effects in the Amirdrassil Raid that can very easily kill you. And so it's more challenging to be able to find like a safe way to utilize it and utilize it consistently. Because other encounters like Smolderon, you just constantly have different fire lines going out all over the place. Something like Nimue, you'd have to really time it correctly with the cutter beams that are flying out from the boss. You could fly above them and then come down so you're avoiding them. There's a number of challenges that happen with it. And while you're doing all this, you're also spending a good 7 or 8 seconds not actively farming up your next pet cooldown, not your next Mindbender, your next Shadowfiend. And that can cause some problems too. As I mentioned before, they did nerf Barrier in this raid, so it's only going to be 20% damage reduction, and this cooldown's kind of weird to use in Amirdrassil since there's a lot of areas where like half the raid is actually soaking some of the damage and the other half is like spread out. You want to make sure you're as aggressive as you possibly can with this cooldown because it still is very powerful. Even if you're only hitting like half of the raid with the Smolderon soak mechanic or something like that, it's still going to be good value. You could also make sure you're trying to use it in the intermission, even though there is like a lot of movement that's happening on the encounter. But if your group isn't actually calling for these things, you just need to be aggressive with their utilization. You can also take advantage of Pain Suppression and potentially even the extra charge of Pain Suppression with Protector of the Frail if you need it in a prog environment. There's a number of encounters where there's like priority soaks that are going out, where some players are having to like soak certain flowers or taking additional damage. Even yourself as you're ramping, you could be utilizing Pain Sup onto yourself or other people if you're also going to be soaking on top of it. Some of the most vulnerable areas for Disc are when you're applying all of your atonements to the raid. You're not really able to like stop and spot heal yourself or others, and you're reliant on your other healers to be able to account for it and kind of bring you up. to making sure you're really having Desperate Prayer on hand, or even Health Pot, Healthstone, as you're in the process of ramping and applying your atonements to protect yourself, will make a massive, massive difference. With all of the natural leech that you have on your gear, it's also going to be pretty easy to be able to produce tons of self-healing when you're actually hitting your ramp. But before that point, it can be a little bit more scary, so be careful. This season with Trinkets, what you want to be targeting is going to be the Balefire branch with the 1.5-minute cooldown. This goes fantastic with Evangelism. And then some of the stat sticks you could get would be like Pips, the Coagulated Genosaur Blood, and maybe even like the Sea Star. There's a couple of different options that you have on hand. You primarily want to have a stat stick followed up with the 1.5-minute cooldown and a Balefire branch, so get ready to start farming a lot of Waycrest Manor. Of course, if these guys helped you out, be sure to subscribe to the channel and check out the Patreon, or consider joining on the YouTube channel if you want to support further. That would be fantastic. Of course, the spec is quite complicated, so for updates, if there's going to be some large-scale ones, I'll be making another video. For timers and for kind of hashing out where you want to play Mindbender versus Shadowfiend, I will have them in my written pages on the Amirdrassil tips page on Wowhead. That's where I'm going to be updating fight timers, which ability you're going to be using between Shadowfiend and Mindbender, and including all of the VODs of my progression kills on top of it as well. So if you're enjoying it, thumbs up. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope it helped. I'll catch y'all next time.